Today, I'm going to show you how one poem from William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul, can be taught to 5-year-olds, to 5th, 6th graders, to 10th, 11th, 12th graders, college students, and so on, and everywhere in between. I'm going to give you a couple of examples to help you see this. I'm going to kind of lay out some different methods that you can use either as a teacher or a parent or whatever, or just as a reader enjoying poetry to help you understand and get more out of this story and out of this very interesting, controversial, thought-provoking poem. And my argument for Songs of Innocence and Experience as a work of literary poetic art is that this should be one of the key primers for teaching poetry. This video, again, to reiterate, is just for the one poem, The Little Black Boy. That's the poem we're going to discuss. So if that's all you're interested in, stick around. We're going to dig a little bit into that. I'm not going to go into everything that's necessary to understand this poem, in my opinion, but I'm going to give you some starters, some interesting things to think about. So this poem, I think, stands out because it really is going to hit you, I think, in a lot of different ways, especially as a modern reader. It allows for rich discussion. It is very controversial. I mean, just the title, The Little Black Boy, and we'll talk about the imagery and things of that nature as well. What I always do with a poem is I always recommend, I don't care how long it is, what it is, it doesn't matter. The important first step is you have to read it aloud. So I'm going to read it aloud for you today. I think you should read it aloud for yourself. And in classroom, you could have the students read themselves, but don't be afraid to read multiple times. The second thing we do is what I call converse with verse. This is just a simple, catchy way to say, just engage with whatever's there on the page to you, wherever you are. It doesn't matter how complex it is. If you understand nothing, then say, I don't understand anything. But you just want to engage with it without looking it up, without Googling, going to ChatGPT. It's about training your own mind and where you are in your knowledge base and the things that it evokes for you. That's the critical part, for you. And then there's you can do an in-depth analysis as a third step. Okay, so let's just get into it. I'm going to read the poem, and then I want you to, just listen along, and then we're going to do a quick converse with verse, and then we'll get into a little bit deeper things, and I'll show you how to teach this, again, to various grade levels. And I hope to show you how, in particular, teaching the entire book, the Songs of Innocence and Experience, is just the best way you can introduce poetry to children. The Little Black Boy by William Blake. My mother bore me in the southern wild, and I am black, but oh, my soul is white. White as an angel is the English child, but I am black as if bereaved of light. My mother taught me underneath a tree, and sitting down before the heat of day, she took me on her lap and kissed me, and pointing to the east began to say, look on the rising sun. There God does live, and gives his light and gives his heat away. And flowers and trees and beasts and men receive comfort in morning, joy in the noonday. And we are put on earth a little space, that we may learn to bear the beams of love. And these black bodies and this sunburned face is but a cloud, and like a shady grove. For when our souls have learned the heat to bear, the clouds will vanish. We shall hear his voice, saying, come out from the grove, my love and care, and round my golden tent like lambs rejoice. Thus did my mother say and kissed me, and thus I say to little English boy, when I from black and he from white cloud free, and round the tent of God like lambs we joy. I'll shade him from the heat till he can bear to lean in joy upon our Father's knee. And then I'll stand and stroke his silver hair and be like him, and he will then love me. Now, I'm willing to bet that really struck you in a variety of reasons. I mean, just the fact that me as a white male in 2024 is reading this, this story and this from the voice of this little black boy probably was striking. And so we're going to get into that a little bit. There's lots of layers that this could be read from. One of them is just the surface level of it sounds a little bit, my mother bore me in a southern wild. And it's got this, simple nursery rhyme cadence to it. Okay, so let's do a quick converse with verse. Now, there's certain questions you should be asking yourself in this, like what's happening in the poem? How does it make you feel? What images or ideas stand out to you? Nothing is necessarily wrong in this converse with verse. This is important. Later on, you may discover that you had a wrong approach, that there's more to it than you understand, and you want to be open to changing your mind about the poem and the meaning of the poem and what's trying to occur in the poem. But when you're first conversing with verse, where you are is where you are. If your first reaction is revulsion, this is racist and disgusting, and I can't believe this, that's where you are. And that's fine. That's good. You want to be there and just understand what made you feel that way. Why did you feel that way? What is it about that? And we're going to dig into what's going on in the poem as we kind of explore it even more. So I'm going to do a little bit of a high-level analysis just to kind of give you a sense of the kind of deeper things that I think are going on, which are not present or prevalent as easy when you first look at it. And I'm not going to do a full analysis because one of the things that I've been talking about with this particular book of poetry is you need to have the whole book read. This is called The Songs of Innocence and Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. So there's something about innocence and there's something about experience. So we don't even know what he means by innocence and experience exactly. That's one of the key questions. What is Blakean experience? What is Blakean innocence? What is he talking about? So we have a story that, I think you can see is from the voice of a little black boy. And what is this little black boy saying? My mother bore me in the southern wild, and I am black, but oh, my soul is white. Now, it's important to remember that this poem is written in 1789. So slavery is not abolished until, I believe, 1834 in England, and then 1860 in America, and then the colonies and everything, is separate times. We're not going to get into all the details of that right now, but it's important to remember that William Blake is writing to a white audience. It's important to you as the teacher to remember this. The students we'll get to in a minute. But as a teacher, it's important for you to remember that William Blake is writing to completely white, Anglo, religious, Christian, English-speaking culture. And so what does he do? He gives this voice, this little black boy, and this little black boy is telling a story. So what do we have here? My mother bore me in the southern wild, and I am black, but oh, my soul is white. So we have this dichotomy already that probably we don't like today. I would imagine you don't like this. The idea that black is inferior and less good, and the soul, because he's saying my soul is white as an angel. So angels are white. So we have this imagery that we all kind of know about today, that white is good and black is bad, which if you think about it from the perspective of a little black boy, that's not, how does he contend with this story? Because again, he's just a little innocent black boy. That's the whole point of this story, of this poem, right? And then he says, but I am black as if bereaved of light. Now he goes into, in the story, we hear, my mother taught me underneath a tree, and sitting down before the heat of day, she took me on her lap and kissed me, and pointing to the east began to say. So she's going to give him a whole story about their origin, a kind of mythological story. What is she going to say? Well, she says, look on the rising sun. There God does live and gives his light and gives his heat away. Okay, so I'm hearing something about the sun. is giving his love and his light away and his heat away, and flowers and trees and beasts and men receive comfort in morning, joy in the noonday. Okay, so what it sounds like she's saying, and again, this is, I think, through the voice of the child repeating what he's heard from his mother. What he's getting is that, so you have the sun and it's like all encompassing, and flowers come from it, and trees and beasts receive comfort and joy from this. And we, that is we, the Black people in this case, are put on earth a little space that we may learn to bear the beams of love. So there's now this connection between the sun and the heat of the sun, which is hot and hurts, right? But that's love. That's what she's, I think, saying here. And these black bodies and this sunburnt face. So there's a kind of connection to this idea that, if you put a magnifying glass, it'll burn something. But what I think this mother is saying, and these black bodies and this sunburnt face is but a cloud and but a shady grove. Okay, so now we have this imagery of this little black boy and this little black, the black mother, that she is saying to the son that they are put on earth to be able to bear the beams of love. So that's an interesting thing to think about. What is he saying with that? I'm not going to give you the answer to that or my thoughts on that yet. This is a little bit more complex, but think about that. For when our souls have learned the heat to bear, the clouds will vanish, and we shall. So in other words, we will no longer be this kind of cloud, this black cloud that's protective. That's what a black cloud protects from the harshness of the sun. The clouds will vanish. We shall hear his voice, probably God, saying, "Come out from the grove, my love and care, and round my golden tent like lambs rejoice." Golden tent is a reference to a Bible quote, by the way. So we're talking about, connecting with Jesus, God, and so on in the afterlife. Thus did my mother say and kissed me. And thus I say to little English boy, when I from black and he from white cloud free, and round the tent of God like lambs we joy. So this is a reference again to the lamb. So we're getting this innocence imagery. So a lot of this is starting to build in this book. We're only 5 poems in and we're getting a lot of imagery that Blake is building on, which is why I think you need to read this whole book as a book of poetry, not just one poem at a time. Continuing with the poem. I'll shade him, the little English boy, from the heat till he can bear to lean in joy upon our Father's knee. And then I'll stand and stroke his silver hair and be like him, and he will then love me. Now, what is he saying? So again, if we're listening to the voice, this is the little boy relaying the story that his mother is telling him about why they are black. Why are they black? And if you think about it again as an adult, think about this from the little boy's perspective. He is essentially a slave, right? We don't know for sure that he's a slave, but he must be a slave. This is 1789 in England. Slavery is not abolished until 1834. So what's he doing there? And he even says at the beginning, my mother bore me in the southern wild. That's a reference to Africa. And which is another way modern readers are going to read this as completely racist. If you're why are we calling Africa wild? But again, this is coming from 1789. This whole thing. And this is why this poem gets very complicated and controversial. This little black boy is relaying this story to this little white boy that his mother told him about why they're black. But then once all of them die, and they're all in heaven in the afterlife where life's going to be better, and there are promises for a better life, now there's going to be an equality. Now, I'm just going to tease you with one thing. I want you to think about you're an 18th century Christian white person, and you believe in this kind of hierarchy on some level, deep down inside you, whether you admit it to yourself or not, that white people are superior to black people. How do you think it's coming across to that person to say that there is a superiority to the black person in terms of being able to bear the heat of love, of God, I should say. So what she's saying here, and the mother, is that they are stronger and more capable of actually bearing the beams of love. You see how subtle that is? So we're not going to get into that too much. That's something for later videos when we talk about this whole book as a whole and compare the poems in this book to other poems in this book. we'll dig into this a little bit more of what's happening here about the narrative that's happening here. Okay. Now, as I was kind of explaining this to you as, a teacher, a parent, a concept came out that I think is very important to teach to kids, but how you teach it is really critical. And that is narrative voice. What is narrative voice? How can you explore it? Why is it important? How can you teach it? And I think this poem and this book is a great time. If you're teaching this book with the little black boy, is a great time to really introduce the concept naturally so that children really start to get a sense of what this really is. So the first question to ask when you're reading, after you read this poem with your class is, who do you think is speaking in the poem? Just ask them. Who do they think, who's speaking it? Is it William Blake, the author? Is it the little black boy? Is it the mother? Is it the English child? And then why do you think that? Right? Like ask them to specifically cite a line or something, or explain why they believe this person is the narrator, the person speaking. Encourage them to cite lines or phrases that support their ideas. Now, the next thing you want to do, in my opinion, is you want to go back to the poems you've already read with them briefly, like The Lamb in Introduction, and even The Shepherd. And you want to ask the same question. So go back to The Lamb, which was the poem right before The Little Black Boy, and just really briefly say, again, it's like, I think 2 stanzas. Who's the speaker in this poem? Right? It's the little boy in this case. It's the little boy speaking, and who is he speaking to? The lamb. So now they're starting to see, okay, so here's a speaker, here's what he's speaking. I could see why I think that he's speaking that way. It's very simple. You can go back to the introduction. Who narrates, who's the speaker in this poem? And, you could read it again, and again, it's a short poem. You don't have to dive into it and investigate it. And you've already read it, but to them, and they've read it themselves. So there's a familiarity. And you say, oh, okay, so who is it? You let them answer. The piper is hopefully what they'll get to. Maybe they'll say it's Cupid. Maybe they'll get a little confused. So that's a good conversation piece. Then you can move into the more complicated, the echoing green. And this is where I'm a believer in enlightening through confusion. So I don't think it's very clear, and I think that's part of the kind of ambiguous, which I would not teach the 6th graders, but this ambiguity is part of the purpose of that poem in the narrative sense. So when you're teaching this, you just kind of ask, well, who's speaking here? Is it a single narrator? And then just get their thoughts and their ideas on this. Are there multiple voices? Maybe encourage them to think about, well, what, and you might come up with a lot of answers, or maybe they won't have anything for you. That's fine too. So now you have these examples you have really clear examples of, okay, the little English boy is speaking, the little black boy is speaking, the piper is speaking. There's probably a kind of more omniscient speaker. Don't use that word, but there's a higher level, maybe just the poet himself, William Blake, is speaking for the shepherd. And then there's something complicated going on with the echoing green. So now we have these 5 examples that we can work with that is short, easy for the student to grasp right there. They've already explored it for a while. And now we can start coming naturally out of that into some kind of broad definition, not a final definition, just something from the students. I want this to come from the students. So what I would recommend for this is just simply as you finish those discussion of who is the speaker and even who are they speaking to, how do you know it, give examples, then just either introduce or just ask them, what do you think we should call this? Just the speaker in a poem, the voice, the narrative, like whatever, just give some examples, let them come up with what they like the most. And then you can kind of guide them through this. Hopefully you get to something like the narrative voice, right? I doubt they're going to say something like perspective. That's too advanced for 5th, 6th graders, I think. I mean, they can get there, but they may not on their own. They need to probably understand voice first. So you get them to that concept, you kind of help them see, and then you kind of say, well, what does this mean though? Like what does it mean to have a narrative voice? So we have the little black boy, he's speaking to the little English boy and maybe to us. And then you maybe can help them kind of see that this is just about the general voice of who is speaking in the poem. And that's really the best I think you're going to get to if you let the students come up with it. Now, if they come up with some more advanced stuff, that's amazing. But, again, in this, I'm thinking in my head, like 4th to 6th grade, and I want them to come up with something. That's critical. And I want to kind of take a pause here to kind of explain my view of a huge teaching pitfall in teaching to children. So in introducing any concept, I don't care if it's science, math, history, literature, but let's talk about literary concepts where I'm more of an expert. You want these concepts to come organically rather than relying on abstract definitions from textbooks. So someone preaching on high, here's what to think. Here's the definition. It's highlighted in black. We're going to have these three different examples of what it looks like. Here's what first person is. Here's what second person is. Here's what third person limited. Here's third person omniscient. And then and it's just random, little paragraph from each one to kind of, and then that's not going to connect with the student. They have to experience it for themselves. And just to give you an example of this, I'd be willing to bet money that if I got a chapter, if I just took out a chapter from from several different classic works of art, of literary art, great art, and I gave it to you, and I told you to identify the voice, is it, in the perspective, is it first, second, third limited, third omniscient, you would probably be able to differentiate between first and third pretty easily, but you probably wouldn't be able to tell that much, like what kind of omniscient is it? What's the limit? Is it limited? How can you tell? Like things like that. I bet there'd be certain nuances you'd be challenged with. And now it's easy for us to kind of get first and third, maybe second, but throwing these concepts at young kids is really a mistake. You really want them to see it in a simple way like this, multiple instances of it, and for them to come up with it themselves. I believe induction is vastly, which is observing reality, observing examples, and then coming up with some kind of understanding of that. Now, you have a higher level understanding of it because you're a subject expert in this. So you can help them, you can help guide them in this, but you still want it to come from them. I've kind of showed you how to adapt this or how to give this lesson to sixth graders. So the idea here is that by this point, you've done a quick reading of introduction of this series by William Blake. You've done The Shepherd, you've done Echoing Green, you've done The Lamb, and now you're doing The English Boy. And when you do The English Boy, you ask them who is the speaker, and you guide them through the understanding, and so that they have whatever definition that they have as a class or as individuals. That's what's important, is that it's theirs, whatever it happens to be, even if it's not on exactly the right track, which is where you can kind of guide them. But that's it. That's the lesson. Just have them some basic understanding of that. I want to add one thing for your knowledge in case you're not aware. One of the important reasons why voice is so important in literary art is not because it might be on a test or they might ask you how to identify things. It's not critical thinking, but it's because of the radical differences in conveying the same message and story and idea through different voices. So if you think about how it might come across if a white, rich nobleman is explaining why slavery is complicated at that time, or if it's an African speaking, quote unquote Africanese, like a combination of English and some pidgin English or something, and you give it to him in his voice that he's like, maybe on a plantation and he's being whipped or something. That's another way. That's another voice you could have. You could have an older white woman or an old black woman telling the story, or you can have a foreigner coming. Like you'd have all these different voices all kind of talking about, the issue of race and hierarchy in the society and slavery. And each of them would be very, very, very different. And they would all have a different tone, a different feel. William Blake has chosen an innocent, young little boy. That is important that he chose that. That is saying something, and it's going to fit into this broader framework. So voice is critical. We sometimes don't really think about it, which is okay. Because when you're reading and experiencing art, remember, you just want to experience it. But when we're thinking about it, it does help to have something about why voice matters. So that's how you do this with sixth graders, as like I already explained. Let's talk about 10th graders. Like, how can you teach this to 10th graders? Now, I'm going to assume that this 10th grader has read the book already, because this book does not take long, but if we're talking 10th grader, they've read the book already. And you can, even again, have them read it when they're younger, bring it back to when they're older. I mean, that's how I recommend doing this. I think you should read these poems to them when they're young, let them, explore some of the ideas in it, quickly, because it's short, when they're a little bit older in 6th grade. And you could do this again in 10th, and you could even do it again in 12th. But here's how you kind of level up. You go a little bit more complicated, a little bit more abstract. So we have voice. So who is the speaker? Now we can ask, well, who is the intended audience? So we can explore the historical context of 1789. How does that influence our interpretation of it, our understanding of it? So discuss slavery laws in England and its colonies. Consider how a contemporary reader, think about a English white woman, Christian woman in 1789 might have felt and responded to this poem. And that idea of the deeper stories and narratives in the audience is another important part of this poem. And you can ask the question, what is the effect of the mother story on the little boy? Is the effect on the little boy to teach him to rebel or to fit in? So what's the problem with these kinds of stories? And we'll get into that a little bit later in this series on Blake, because that's an important part that we're doing. You could also ask deeper questions about, well, what does he mean by innocent? Is the mother innocent? Is the child innocent? Why is this in the Songs of Innocence for the Songs of Innocence and Experience? And we'll dig into these things, but I'm just trying to help you see how this can go deeper for a 10th grader. And if you want, if you're like in an AP class and you're trying to get a little bit more complex, you could do comparative literature. So there is a whole class of anti-slavery poetry out of England at this time. So you can compare Blake's poem with other anti-slavery works of the 18th century. So for example, the first one of these is The Dying Negro by John Bicknell, Bicknell. And this is in 1773, this is published. You can go even deeper. So you could just do a kind of a comparison, look at, read one, read the other one. Dying Negro is much longer and complex, and there's others like this you can choose from. But then you can, if you want to go even deeper, you could talk about appropriated voices. So we're building on this stuff, right? So we have voices, we have audiences, we have the audience back then, we have you as an audience today as a reader hundreds of years later. And then we could talk about appropriating voices. So what does it mean to appropriate a voice? Well, William Blake is a white Christian male living in a pretty decent life in the 18th century. And he's taking the voice of a little black boy and a black mother, giving them a voice and then selling that to white people. Now, he was an abolitionist. He was a staunch abolitionist. He was a staunch anti-slavery writer, but he's still appropriating voices. So is that appropriate? What does it mean to appropriate a voice? Is that good? You see how this is a deeper AP, like higher level question. And then you can analyze the differences in approach if you want to go even deeper. So there's a variety of different anti-slavery poets. Again, troubadour.studios. And you'll go there and you can check out some more as we get into this course more. You can see, I'll give you examples there's a whole bunch of this coming out of this era as the abolition movement grows and grows and grows. And there's different approaches. So there's lots of white English writers and writers in general and poets who are appropriating black voices. Sometimes they're appropriating a slave on a slave ship. And the goal of the poem is to make the white reader feel guilty. Nevertheless, they're taking and they're putting white language into the black person's skin and body. Well, what's going on there? Is that good, bad? What do you think? And that's, I'm not trying to give you my thoughts on this exactly, but there are also quote unquote authentic voices. So there are ex-slaves who are writing. So at this time, so incorporate them into this. So you see how this one poem, The Little Black Boy, could be extrapolated from once you understand what Blake is saying into a whole world of literature and art used for the purpose of affecting change in a culture. and what are good ways of doing that, bad ways of doing it, how you do. And you see how, like, as you go up the steps, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, this could be a master's thesis in college. There's a variety of different things you could do for this. If you're really good and you have control over this, like if you're at homeschool, I would really recommend, as you get into the higher grades, incorporating this kind of thing, the Little Black Boy, into a broader curriculum showing the abolitionist movement, discussing socio-political climate of the 18th century, doing a cultural studies analysis of this era, using this poem and other poems, exploring how literature reflects and influences societal ideas and attitudes. What are we learning about Blake that is explaining the views of that time and how people felt about Black people and white people and so on and so forth. So one of the strengths of Blake's collection is its ability to grow with the student. So young children enjoy the rhythmic and melodic qualities. As students mature, they can revisit the poems with deeper comprehension. Older students can tackle complex themes and engage in critical thinking. And there's a lot of advantages for helping to teach literary concepts through poetry like this. So often when we teach this, we teach it with long narratives, complicated stories that, you're struggling just to see the concept itself. Or we teach the concept by getting, the common way to teach like narrative voice is you just have first, second, third limited, third omniscient or something, maybe fourth. And you just have a block of random text. And it's just like, I watched the boat sink. You watched the boat sink. George watched the boat sink, that kind of thing. That is just a completely backwards way of teaching this. No one's going to remember that. It's not going to be retained or understood. The concepts that you teach should aid in the understanding, appreciation, and experiencing of great art. That's my philosophy of teaching in the humanities. So if you're teaching a historical concept or something to help you understand history, it shouldn't be something that's just a highlighted, bolded in black and you're supposed to memorize it. It should be something that really aids the student in comprehending some important historical concept. And speaking of literature, that's what I'm showing you with narrative voice. You should never, ever, under any circumstances, teach this as a floating abstraction with a bunch of text and just try to memorize things. It should only be an aid to helping you understand and appreciate and enjoy literary art. That is my discussion of The Little Black Boy by William Blake. We're going to move on to other videos and other poems after this. And then at the end, after we've done all the poems, we're going to do pairings of poems. So that's important. There's a song of innocence and a song of experience for many of the poems in this book, where they are supposed to be, or they can be paired to help you get more understanding of it. So we're going to really dig into this whole series with this course. So I hope you'll follow along. Go to troubadour.studios and sign up and get more information. And there's a lot more coming. And the support that I get from you is critical in my pursuit and continuing of this series and creating material that I hope will help you teach your students. See you next time.